I'm very excited to have time together with Giulio Boccaletti, who is a man who has a varied history of life and experiences. And like many of us, he's come to understand water and water's key role in life. And he's written a book unlike anyone else that I know of to date. And I've read over 70 books on water, and his book, A Biography of Water, truly has a perspective that is historic. So with that, we're going to start. Giulio, any opening comments before we get into our chat that you'd like to share?
Well, first of all, Stuart, it's a great pleasure to be here with you, and what a wonderful way to start a conversation. Aside from the fact that you have this remarkable sunrise right behind you. The only remark I would say is that, the invocation that we just heard in a way captures the spirit of what I was trying to do with my book in a very different language and in a very different context, because in a way I'm trying to reveal, to the reader and to all of us that we often think of water in a somewhat, kind of theatrical terms. It's a thing that's out there in the landscape, and it just is part of the set of the stage on which we live our life, and in fact it's a powerful force that transforms our world in many ways, many more than we really realize in our modern lives. And so that's what I was trying to reveal, and in a way the invocation really captured that, talking about thunder and rain, and I think it was a fitting way to start this conversation.
Thank you, Giulio. In our conversations with each other leading up to this, you've talked about water and its like hidden messages, and it's like this. There's something here that either we don't see or water doesn't fully reveal to us, and I'm interested how that theme and that thread will come into our time together today. But I want to look at first is for you to give us some examples of modern day systems and societal norms that we use today that were first established due to a civilization's initial relationship with water being so fundamental.
Yeah, well, in a way, Stuart, that's the thesis of my book. And as probably has happened to many of us here, at some point in the past, I caught the water bug. In the sense that I started to look around and saw water everywhere. And I wanted to reveal how our dialectic relationship with substance over time had contributed to shaping many institutions that regulate our life today, including some that you might not think of. In the book, I talk a lot about, for example, the origins of monotheism and its relationship to aridity in the Middle East. There's a segment on the relationship between water distribution and democracy. We might talk about that in a second. I can come back to any of these examples, but or indeed the nature of the legal system that we all enjoy today, which has its origin in the Roman world. One of the reasons I felt the need to do this is that we live in a very particular time in human history. Just to kind of give some coordinates of the story that I tell, water's been on the planet for a long, long time, far longer than we have been around. There's some debate about the timing of this, but it's probably around 3.8 billion years. And we've, Homo sapiens has been the dominant hominid species for the last 300,000 years. But really, as far as we can tell, the dominant sort of cultural traits of modern society emerge out of the last 10,000 years when we become sedentary, right? In the sort of Neolithic revolution. Most societies today are sedentary. That wasn't always the case, but over time, sedentary populations pretty much outpopulated everybody else. And for 9,900 years of those 10,000 years, it wouldn't have been a mystery to anybody that water was fundamental in shaping the institutions of our life together. because water was the dominant force that operates on the landscape on time scales and geographical scales that matter to us. Water forces us to operate together, build levees, construct dams, cut canals to move water from where it is to where we need it, catch water when it comes down so we can deliver it when we need it. And so, for most of history, most people like us on this call today would have waded a river on their way to work, whatever that labor might have been. And then over the last 100 years, 150 years or so, it was this remarkable modernist dream of emancipating us from nature and from the variability of the climate system. And we largely succeeded, which is why none of us wades a river on the way to work, and all of us open a tap to get, all of us in the rich world at least, open a tap to get a water out of the wall, remarkably, not having to worry about where that comes from. And in the process, we kind of lost touch with the water origin of many of our institutions. And so the long answer to your question, but the point of the book is exactly to reveal that. And if you ask me which institutions and which habits surround us today that have their origin in the relationship to water, I would tell you almost all of them. In fact, it's more a question not which ones, but at what point did each one of the institutions that surround us, whether it's laws, political systems, religious systems, at what point did the relationship with water provide a generative moment when we really shape them? And for example, in the case of political systems, there are many. If we had more time, I told you when we prepared for this, Stuart, you'll have to stop me every so often because I just ramble on. But let me just make this one last point and then I'll shut up. If you're interested, you can read it in the book. But one of the interesting things that matter to, I think, all of you is the American Constitution is literally dripping with water, right? The origin of the Constitution, and in fact, all of the federal regulations of the environment, which are steeped in commercial law, the Constitution, American Constitution is basically a treaty on the rivers of the country, right? It emerges out of the Mount Vernon Compact that Washington agreed on the Potomac Canal, on what he hoped would be the Potomac Canal. And so just to say, pretty much any institution that surrounds us today, you can bet, has genetic material that comes from our relationship to water.
You talk about this critical role that water's played in every really dimension of civilization. And at some point, I'd like to talk about and come back to the religious side and how water was so sacred in religious. Can you share with us, when did our relationship as a society with water shift from water being this, we'll call it more sacred element, to being a pure commodity and us using and manipulating water?
Well, I think there's no one point in which that transition happens if we're talking about let me split this in two parts. So there's a long period of time across multiple societies and cultures where those two approaches to water coexist. Water shapes the landscape, it's reified in most cultures, and it's not a coincidence that most societies up to the rise of a Brahmitic tradition have, pantheistic views of what water is. It's a deity, it flows down from the mountain, and it sort of embodies some form of God. It's not a coincidence that monotheism, Brahmitic religions emerge out of arid landscapes where you end up with a higher order abstraction, where the God is actually external to the laws of nature, creates the laws of nature, as opposed to being governed by laws of nature, which is what happens in most other societies. So that thread runs all the way through to, arguably the 19th century. Walden Pond and the Transcendentalists are an expression of that reification, albeit a literary one, right? And you could argue that we've sort of lost it in the 20th century, but I'll come back to that because I actually think it's even more recent than that. It's the last 50 years that we've really lost track of the importance of water. Now, along all of that, though, we always had, we've been fundamentally agricultural societies for the vast majority of our history. And, you know well that if it's green and it grows, well, it probably needs water, right? And so inevitably, the techne, the problem of managing water, just from a practical perspective, accompanies all history of society. And because managing water is heavy, it's a ton per cubic meter, it moves around, does work on scales that far transcend the individual, right? I mean, water is an expression of the climate system. And so it reflects the energetics of the climate system. If you take, the chief earlier was talking about the power of thunder and rain. Well, if you take your average hurricane coming through the Atlantic, just a single one over the course of 2 weeks, as a thermal engine uses as much energy as the world economy uses in a year, right? So water phenomena are extraordinarily energetic compared to the size of the life of an individual. And so over the course of all of our history, we've had to exercise a collective agency in order to confront the power of water. So alongside this kind of theocratic view of the world, there's this very practical view of the world of having to work together to build a levee or to build a dam or to cut a canal. And anytime you have to work together, there's this question of who decides what to do. And so inevitably, you end up with some form of political organization. And this is not to say that water causes political organization, but in the development of political institutions, the fact that we have to manage water on the landscape is a dominant shaper of the nature and form of those institutions. So those things kind of run in parallel. So you ask me, when does that separation happen? It never really happens. And in fact, even in the 20th century, you could say, if you said the great modernist dream of the progressive era, right, the great dams of the West, the Hoover Dam, the great constructions that transformed the hydrology of the West in hydraulics in service of the economy of the 20th century, right? Even if at that point you say, what's the most iconic kind of imagery of that? Well, it's, Margaret Burke White's photographs of Fort Beck Dam on the Missouri, which graced the Edward Luce's Time first cover of Life magazine. And so even though we have this very practical and technical relationship with water through the 20th century, we conceive it as iconic, right? Even if not as religious, but as iconic, as sort of really deeply tied to identity. We only really lose that when we lose the land, when people move away from agriculture, which happens really after the Second World War. Agriculture becomes a tiny fraction of the economy, right? We transition from the industrial economy to the service economy. Labor productivity in services and technology explode. Agriculture ends up becoming, a few percentage points of the economy. And suddenly everybody turns their back to the landscape and looks at their screen. And that I would say is when we really kind of lose the plot. And what's interesting about that is that that's changing again, right? We invested all this resource in transforming the landscape so that we could turn our back to it and just look at our screens. But a changing climate means a changing water world, and the water is cracking through the dams and the levees and showing itself at our doorstep, right? And so that's going to change again.
Fascinating. You made a reference about water and water being such a key role in economics and how that's played such a critical part of it. Has water ever been used as a currency? And have they bartered water like they have otherwise? And do you see in the future, we've looked at actually creating a water coin to value water? Love your historical perspective and that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating question, and again, Stuart, you'll have to intervene when I sort of start droning on in my enthusiasm for the topic. But obviously, the United States has a long history in the West of this question of how do you think about water as a thing that you can own and trade, right? And of course, what water we're talking about matters a great deal here, because we're not talking about water, the molecule. The molecule of water, there's an abundance of it on the planet. It's distributed very unevenly. Most of it's in the oceans. And really the question is kind of where it rains. But the water that people experience is mediated by the infrastructure that we build and the transformation of the landscape that we implement in effect, right? And so really, when you're talking about water as a tradable commodity, as a valuable thing. What is the thing that has value? Well, it's the experience of water, right? It's the access. It's water when you need it and where you need it. And water, water has this property of generating infinite puns. But in this case, water is, eminently illiquid, right? Because water in Denver is not going to be very helpful to you in Hawaii, even though it's the same molecule, and there may be scarcity of one and not of the other. And yet, has this not a commentary on the amount of water, the molecule in the planet. It's just a commentary of how much water of that kind do you have. And this, in fact, can get kind of even more complicated in that water has also time properties, right? It's not just where it is, but when it is. When is it available? You open your tap in your home in Hawaii and you have 24/7 water. That's not the doing of nature. It's the doing of somebody else. And so that product is not fungible, is not a substitute for the water that might rain on your garden on a tropical thunderstorm, right? So when we say, can water be used as a currency, we have to recognize that we're talking about an infinity of products, most of which are segmented away from each other and non-tradable. That's one of the big challenges of thinking about markets when it comes to water. So that's the first thing I'd say. From a historical perspective, you have to remember that for most of history, people didn't have an enormous amount of infrastructure. So the planet hadn't been engineered to the degree that it has today. And so historically, you find water traded in two settings, essentially. One is in extremely arid context. There's a famous water market in Oman that's been around for about 4,000 years. And, typically what people are trading is actually the time access to the water. There's a certain amount of water in the community. There's going to be a system of distribution, and what you're trading is not the water. You're not collecting the water and giving it to somebody. You're actually trading what's tokenized in objectionable kind of contemporary language is not the water itself, is the access to the infrastructure. And there are instances in many societies where that's happened. And people barter around that access. The most famous example of this is oddly in Switzerland, where there's a village called Turbel, which is a village in the Valais canton of Switzerland, where it's a small village, it's about 200 people, and there's a system of irrigation there that essentially distributes water through wooden canals. These are present in all of Switzerland, but in particular there are these wooden canals that bring water to each of the plots of land farmed by each individual. And there's an incredibly sophisticated schedule of distribution, so that each plot gets a certain amount of water when the sun's at a certain point in the sky. And there was a pretty famous anthropologist in the 70s called Robert Netting, who studied this system and asked the question, well, who planned this? Who built this system that is such a sophisticated scheduling thing? And what he discovered was, one, that nobody in the system knew the whole schedule, and yet it worked. And B, that actually nobody had planned it. It's an emergent property of the system. People tinkered over centuries since the 12th century, essentially, and developed this very complicated system of trading that didn't require any central regulator, just emerged as a property. And incidentally, that's where Elinor Rostrom did her studies and got ultimately the Nobel Prize in economics for. It was kind of an emergent property that was a common good. So back to your question, I mean, there are a lot of examples where people bartered and traded water. Typically, it's trading access. It's trading access to some existing or emergent infrastructure rather than trading the molecule itself. Today, it gets even more complicated because what we're trading is access to incredibly expensive infrastructure, right? We built hundreds of billions of dollars worth of infrastructure over the course of the 20th century. The West of the United States is a particularly good example of that. And then you have all these problems in the West with kind of trading water that it would be impossible to trade had it not been for the vast investments in infrastructure that were made before. Similar problem you have in Australia, right? Very arid, very engineered landscapes. Whether you can solve the sort of water problem through trading alone is a good question. I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I'm I'm less convinced the more I think about it. Actually, I used to be very convinced, and now I'm less convinced as time goes on. Because it's sort of like, would you solve the problem of interstate highways by trading? Because to me, it's a very similar problem, and the answer, I suspect, is no. Anyway, I'm droning on, but that would be my first answer to your question.
Such a fascinating perspective and understanding of it, and how, as you say, it's really all about the infrastructure and the delivery and access to water versus the purity of the water itself. When we look at the historical perspective of water, there's one of those most famous quotes by Mark Twain, who said that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. And we've heard for decades we're going to have water wars. So I'd love for you to comment. Has there ever really been true wars fought over water throughout civilization's time?
Yeah.
And do you think in the future we're going to have water wars, and water is going to be more expensive than oil, and people are going to value that, for whatever, hundreds or thousands of dollars per gallon?
No one knows is the short answer, so I'll just get that out ahead of time so I can land it. Incidentally, the quote is unattributed, so everybody thinks it's Mark Twain, but there's no actual evidence of him saying this. So it's always quoted as said by Mark Twain. But there's another quote I love, which is in fact attributed in an essay William Faulkner wrote, that the Mississippi is that river that runs through your living room and takes the piano away with it, which I think is a kind of good image of the power of Old Man River. So water wars, first it's worth thinking through, how did we end up with this idea that there would be water wars? And it's a fairly recent phenomenon, actually. It turns out that after the Camp David Accords, after the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Six-Day War, Sadat, then president of Egypt, made this off-the-cuff remark about the next time Egypt will go to war will be over water. And it was a not too thinly veiled message to the decolonizing countries upstream of Egypt on the Nile. I would note, by the way, that Egypt hadn't gone to war on the Nile, despite years of saying so. Then that story was picked up. Sadat, unfortunately, was killed in 1981. His foreign minister kind of edited that claim by saying, the next war in the Middle East will not be fought over politics, but will be fought over water. And that was, of course, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who then became the Secretary General of the United Nations. And then there was a third Egyptian in the 90s who picked up that story again, Ismail Sargeldin, who said that in a meeting at Stockholm, in the big water conference in Stockholm, speaking to managers. And the whole quote was, "The next wars will be fought on water if we don't sort out all of our management issues." Right? He was speaking to a bunch of water experts. But now we're in the 90s, the media world had exploded. CNN and BBC picked up on this thing, and they truncated the quote, so they only said the first part, which said the next wars will be fought on water, as opposed to the next war will be fought on water if we don't do this thing. And so something that was said for effect ended up becoming a prediction. The next wars will be fought on water. And it's catchy because water wars is an alliteration that works. And so ever since we've been debating this thing, there's a scholar at the University of Oregon, I think he's still at the University of Oregon, called Aaron Wolf, who asked the question as to whether there's any empirical evidence that water scarcity was the principal cause of conflict. Now, that, first of all, you have to assume that conflicts have a single cause, which is almost never true, right? But his empirical conclusion was that the only water war that we know of is a war that's documented in the Stele of Vultures in the Louvre, which is a rock from about 2500 BCE that describes the war between Umma and Girsu, which were two city-states in the lower Euphrates basin. But we only have the point of view of Girsu, the winner. And the story claims that it was a fight over a plot of land along the levee of the Euphrates. And if that's true, then that is probably the first water war. But Aaron Wolf also concludes that was probably also the last one. In other words, even the Arab-Israeli conflict, you'd be hard-pressed to argue that the problem in the Arab-Israeli conflicts, the sequences that started with the end of the mandate, are caused by water. Of course, water becomes an instrument of battle, right? I mean, just because like any other geography, right? So the Syrians cut off the Golan Heights, trying to divert water from getting into the Sea of Galilee. And so the Israeli respond by taking over the Golan Heights and taking over what are now called the occupied territories, right? But that's not because of water. That's because of conflict between Israel's attempt at establishing the state and, Nasser's pan-Arabism at the time and the Ba'athist parties and, the then sort of formed Arab state. So, I think, so bottom line is, I don't think the water wars story is a credible explanation for the past, but there is a way in which the water security nexus is important, which is there is important evidence for water being an instrument of diplomacy. So when countries tend to be in conflict, in fact, transnational water management ends up being a vehicle for dialogue. We've seen this on the Indus Treaty between Pakistan and India, a treaty that has withstood the test of time and 3 wars between those countries, and yet continue to operate. We see this between the Taliban in Afghanistan and the Iranians on the Helmand River. We see this even in the Nile. I mean, for all of the threats of Egypt, we've had a Nile Basin initiative working for the last 30 years. It hasn't succeeded in coming to a treaty for the Nile, but those countries are talking to each other even with difficulties. And so anyway, so that's a long answer to your question, but the answer is no and no.
Well, as you bring that up, I think about the positive and optimism of the recent treaties for the oceans, and for the worlds to begin to say that the oceans are owned together and to protect them, and to really recognize no one truly owns the ocean at all. And yet we have to unite to look at how do we look at these waters, which is all one water, to protect them together. One of the topics that was brought up, and you brought up about, so it's really about the infrastructure and the delivery of water today. And historically, it was all about getting water and having the water. Well, how do we look at today? That's still an issue, of course, because over 2 billion people on the planet don't have access to water and sanitation hygiene. Yet we have other much more complicated issues today of not just getting the water, but what is the water that we are getting? And we are focused in our efforts for improving the quality of water, and particularly the toxins and PFAS, which we believe are the canary in the coal mine. So could you talk about that, and whether there's any historical perspective with, I'm sure there was coliform and bacteria in water throughout civilizations, yet we've got a whole new issue of what is the water we're drinking today?
Yeah, well, that becomes an issue as soon as people start living densely together. And that, the access to water, the amount of water that we have and the quality of the water that we have access to are intimately connected, of course, because the quantity of water defines the dilution of all the potential pollutants, right? And so in a way, these two things are not separate aspects of the problem. They're deeply connected. And, you have to think about people living together. If I talk a fair amount in the book about Uruk. Now, Uruk was a city that was founded in 4000 BCE, lasted for about 5,000 years, and ended long before Europe got into its Middle Ages. And at one point it had reached several 100,000 inhabitants. And in those situations, when you have a densely packed population, you inevitably have issues with waterborne diseases. And so that's been the primary kind of pollution issue for a long time, until you get to the second industrial revolution, where you start having issues with chemical processing and dyes and and then Tom's River comes up, and all these kind of other kind of tragic stories of impact. So on the one hand, you know, the relationship between quantity and quality is intimate, and I think particularly in developed countries, we've sort of turned the corner. I was talking to somebody earlier about this question. You know, they asked me about the Taoist versus Confucian relationship to water, right? You could argue that the 20th century was a very Confucian century, in that it's essentially exercised enormous amounts of control over water in an attempt to create a entirely stable environment for us. And then different countries came to the conclusion at different times that that was in fact not going to be possible. There was going to be always some event that would escape the design of whatever infrastructure we build to contain it. And so we started realizing that we had to make room for the river, which is something that people talk about a lot, right? And this happened in the Mississippi in the 1920s. It happened in Holland in the 1950s. And since then, we've kind of recovered a relationship with the natural world, certainly in developed countries. And that includes also a deep awareness of pollution issues, which really start in the 1960s with the kind of pesticide concern, and then reaches all the way to today. Those issues, by the way, have bizarre lasting consequences. Italy had a scare in the 80s with dioxin, with a particular pollutant out of a chemical factory. And ever since then, and to this day, Italy is the second largest market for bottled water as a result of that. Even though, that's why you get all these San Pellegrino, Panna, all these Italian labels. It's because in the 80s, people got scared with pollution. And even though drinking water, potable water from the utilities is perfectly safe in Italy, that habit stuck. And so, sometimes this relationship with quality ends up having lasting legacies. Anyway, so in the developed world, I think we've started to wrestle with this question. Of course, if you go to the developing countries, having the knowledge that we have today about the importance of everything from chemical pollutants to endocrine disruptors, countries that are still industrializing are going through this problem of having to industrialize, having all that knowledge, but not maybe being able to manage it, right? And that's where I think there's a responsibility of the developed world to help. And alas, we don't have a great track record of that.
Oh, we sure don't. I'd like to open it up to everyone here in our community to offer comments or questions. West, I know you have some questions or some comments you'd like to make.
Yeah, I think I was the one that brought up of the Confucian versus the Taoist view of water, which got us into the sort of the brute force versus the can we work with the natural rhythms of water. I was sort of interested too in the whole idea of one of the things that you talk about in your book is that the vast majority of water management, even today, consists of modifications to the landscape that have been around for a long time. I mean, things like dams, levees, it hasn't changed much. Today, there is some change, though. Ways of obtaining water, particularly drinking water, from the atmosphere, from desalination, from those kinds of things, which are really a function of some more modern technologies. What do you think the chances of those things actually coming to be an important part of what we do in terms of producing at least drinking water, and perhaps coming up to par with, or maybe even overtaking sort of the resurrection or modification of these more ancient kind of technologies?
I mean, I think there's the answer splits. If you're talking about providing water services to an increasingly densely dense urban population, which is kind of where we're headed and have been for a while, then there's no question that there's a technological frontier that continues to evolve, and I have no doubt that it will play an important role. We were having actually this conversation in one of the breakouts where the question was, could we imagine a world in which each household. I don't know if, I think it was Jose, I don't know if he's still there, but what if each household could essentially have a layer of technology that could deliver all of its water services, including maybe the completely circular, right? So the household is entirely circular. Its wastewater gets recycled, and you end up with this world that's self-contained and off the grid. And isn't that a possible answer? It's conceivable. The problem is that water, as we've seen in the pandemic, water is first and foremost a public health intervention. So the purpose of having water utilities is not to provide commodity services to people. The purpose is to ensure the public health of the community. So it's a collective action, right? Public utility has a function that transcends its particular technological form. You could deliver public utility services through a myriad of distributed systems. But the question is, who holds the liability of the public trust, of the public health, right? Because public utilities have a statutory obligation to provide water and clean water, right? I mean, it's not just an economic obligation. The contract is not just with the individual. It's with the ultimate concessionaire, which is the state or the city or the municipality. And so if you do that through 5 million kits distributed to 5 million people living in, a large city, it is not entirely self-evident to me that that is a cheaper way of doing it if you have the responsibility of making sure they all work. So whilst the technology may be perfectly viable and could be done in a world in which everybody's just responsible for their own supply, that's not a republic you're describing. Because in a republic, we live in a collective project where we have obligations towards each other. Even the United States, which is in fact in many ways the model republic, that is still true. And so I'm less and it's not a technology problem, it's an institutional problem, right? So now that's all for the story for potable water. For agriculture, again, agriculture is important for 2 reasons. One is it produces food, and the vast majority of people on the planet, there's 1 billion people that live essentially in subsistence agriculture. They're not even part of the labor force. They just live off what the land produces. Those people have no capital, no formal capital. They have other forms of capital, but they don't have any formal capital, but can still draw water from a river, and they can still modify the landscape. And indigenous tribes can make claims about their sovereign title over the landscape. If you imagine that agriculture gets served by technologically produced water, maybe everything goes to hydroponics because suddenly everything can be done vertically, et cetera, et cetera. You land in this problem where equity becomes a real question, right? Because it's not obvious that markets for food are heavily subsidized for good reason, because we don't want to live on a planet where 2 billion people don't have any food to eat, because they'd all move to our doorstep. So I think that there's kind of a real question as to whether you can make a system work where technology, and therefore access to technology, and therefore property rights on technology, all right, are the fundamental enabling factor. There's a last aspect to this which is really important. It's less obvious to people we're living in the US, but it's far more obvious to anybody living in Europe. If you look at the EU budget, the European Union has a budget, and half of its budget on average over the last 20 years, it's coming down, but even today, 31% of the budget of the European Union, which is essentially the equivalent of the federal government here, is spent on the common agricultural policy, right? That's direct subsidies to farmers. Agriculture is only 3% of Europe's GDP. So why would you spend 30% of your money on something that produces 4% of your GDP? And the reason is because Hitler only took a month to get to Paris. And so how do you express sovereignty over your landscape when you have a lot of neighbors? Well, what you do is you ensure that people don't all move to the city, right? You want people living in the places that need to be eventually defended. And that, until very recently, you might have thought that was a oddly passé and somewhat archaic belief, except that we've just had a territorial invasion in Europe. And so I think that agriculture is an expression of sovereignty, is an expression of power over landscape. You know, territory, the word territory doesn't come just from the word terra, land in Latin. It comes from the word terrere, which means to terrorize. It's the same root as terrorism. It's the idea that territory is defined by the ability of the state to keep people out. And a large part of that is about the property rights that you give on land. And so for all these reasons, I think it's hard to imagine that we would solve all these problems at the margin simply by buying kit. You know, this transcends the marginalist revolution. It goes to the heart of what it means to exercise sovereignty over space, and water plays a central role in that.
Yeah, and I
Brilliant.
think this brings up the relationship, the really close relationship between food and water, and that basically agriculture takes 80% of the water, and in the industrialized world, the water footprint of a human being is about 90% food,
Yes.
which is interesting. A couple questions on this. One, do you think things like water footprints, which are really devised to look at the hidden water, the embedded water in all the products and services that we indulge in, will eventually have any major impact in looking at water as being a deciding factor in what we eat, what we consume, you know, what we do as far as a service or not? Yeah.
Well, so the virtual, I mean, the great thing, Tony Allen came up with that concept in the 80s, and then Hoekstra sort of expanded it and created these beautiful maps that show you where the water is flowing. And it's really remarkable, right? Because there's this vast river in the world that nobody sees, but this flows through the commerce of cereals, essentially, and connects the world. And incidentally, America is a vast exporter of water. And in fact, it's in a way, the direction of travel of all that water is a symptom of power. In the Bronze Age, Egypt used to be that, right? It used to export Nile water all over the Mediterranean. The problem is, if you apply this lens of essentially commodities, you have to ask yourself, where does the value reside? And the way I think about water is that you have a sort of spectrum here. The value of an electron delivered to your home is almost entirely in the electron, or the BTU of oil primarily, because there's so much value in energy that the infrastructure that you need to get it to you is immaterial fundamentally to the economics. That's why it's a completely marginal problem. Now, if you go to gas, that's not quite true. Gas doesn't have a global price, because actually part of the value of natural gas resides in the infrastructure that you need to get it, the pipes, the LNG terminals, all that stuff, right? Now, water is at the other end of the spectrum. All of the value of water is in the access, right? All of the, not just economic value, but the sort of societal value, right? The utility of water is entirely in how it gets to where it's needed. So of course, water is in the planet, there's a lot of it, right? But the question is, it's always in the wrong place. So the whole value is there, which makes water economically behave like an airport or like a road, right? That's why it's so hard to finance, because you can't actually, it's very hard to get people to pay at the margin the total value of the thing, because it costs a lot more than what people are willing to pay at the margin for the next cubic meter of water. So now you go to the virtual water picture, and what are you carrying then? What value are you carrying in the virtual picture? Well, it depends on where it came from, right? Because, you know, you might be carrying water in coffee that was essentially rain-fed in the Amari region of Ethiopia. That water came for free. And it will continue to come for free. It's not, there's no kind of economic kind of content in the fact that there's a lot of water in that coffee. But if the coffee came from some place where, and I'm not talking about other environmental impacts at this moment, but if coffee is mostly not irrigated, but suppose you were to irrigate coffee, then that irrigated coffee would be carrying water that had a very different value from the rain-fed coffee. And so one of the challenges of of the virtual water story is that whilst it reveals these connections between countries, it actually has no content about the economics. Because as I said earlier, water is 1 million products. And so you are actually conflating natural gas, oil, coal, right? You're conflating things that are sort of delivering the same thing, but whose economics are completely different.
Amazing insights that you have, Giulio, and ways that you understand water and its complex relationships. Jerry, I'd love to hear any thoughts, comments, or questions that you might have.
Well, yeah, I guess my viewpoint comes from an entirely different source from Giulio's. And it is that I think we need really to understand water at its basis, because if we do understand water, then a lot of considerations may differ from current considerations, and it's sort of like the solar system. You know, if we think of the Earth as the center of the solar system, it becomes a bit complicated, but once we realize that it's the sun, then matters become more straightforward, and we have a better understanding of all phenomena related to space and such. So similar to water, and that's why we made some discoveries, and the discoveries are more than laboratory curiosities, discoveries about the very nature of water. And without going into great detail, because this is not the right forum, but we found that water has a fourth phase, and the fourth phase is an ordered phase of water. And this idea of a concept of an ordered a phase of water where the molecules are actually ordered is an old idea. It was never a widely accepted idea, but we have now, I think, a massive amount of evidence that it's true. And just one of the consequences of it, and there are many, just like putting the sun at the center of the solar system, one of the consequences is energy, and of course, energy is a commodity of huge value. And we found that this kind of this fourth phase of water has potential energy. It's like a battery, you know, and it can supply electrical energy. And the battery basically is charged by sunlight. It's just like photosynthesis. You know, the first step of photosynthesis, the way the plant gets its energy is that light comes, it hits the plant, and the water in the plant, step one, the water in the plant gets separated into a positive and negative. That's precisely what we found. And we found that it occurs beyond the first step in photosynthesis, which, by the way, is 100% efficient. It occurs naturally. It occurs inside your body. This water fills your cells. It's filled with potential energy, and it's all over the environment. It's just plentifully, and the fact that it's got energy says a lot about it in what it can do and what it can supply. And so, I mean, I could go into great detail about this, but I just want to say that once you know that water has these properties, a lot of issues become clarified. And I without going into detail, for example, weather. So weather is a big issue, but nobody really understands weather. Nobody understands exactly how water evaporates. There are some theories. Nobody understands how clouds form, and these sort of secrets are revealed to me by people who are actually in the field, and it's really clear. If you look, for example, for ideas on the genesis of weather, how it all happens, there's really little that you can find, and we're able to show, starting from first principles, and based on these discoveries, that you can understand weather from first principles onward, and you can explain hurricanes twisters, and you can understand what turns on the rain. Here in Seattle, we have plenty of gray skies, but nobody knows whether those gray skies will unleash rain or won't unleash rain. And nobody understands the principles of, who unzips the cloud, et cetera, et cetera. But if you start with these principles of understanding this phase of water, then you can understand how this happens. So the understanding of the basic fundamental properties of water is so critical to understanding phenomena that surround water. And I just gave the example of weather, but also how we function, all of cell biology. If this water is filling our cells, which we maintain that it is, then the principles of understanding of health change. They're radically different from what we think today. Water, from what we learned, is centrally involved in every function of the cell. And if you read the cell biology book, you'll read that, water is merely a background carrier of the more important molecules of life. And I believe that's incorrect, and that water is actually absolutely central for everything that our cells do. So I don't want to give a speech on this, but I just wanted to say that I think from a different point of view, that understanding the fundamental principles of water and water structure, understanding that is critical for every aspect of water. I think I should stop there.
Thank you, Jerry.
Sure. Pleasure.
Giulio, any comments?
Well, a lot of them are very interesting. I would have a lot. My degree is actually in geophysical fluid dynamics, and I'm a meteorologist by training, so I enjoyed a lot of the remarks. I mean, one thing I think is interesting is I agree that it's endlessly fascinating, right? I mean, we've tried to assess the Earth's climate sensitivity for years and years and years, and we've got a number. Suki Manabe came up with a number in the 60s, this famous paper, Weather of the Manabe, that came up with this estimate based on a very simple model with a very large uncertainty. And that uncertainty hasn't changed in, years. Fundamentally, we still have essentially the same climate sensitivity to carbon dioxide that we had 30, 40 years ago. And in the end, a lot of it has to do with unresolved processes at the microphysical level. Much like like Gerald was describing, or of the nature that Gerald was describing. So it's sort of interesting that our future depends on our response to a problem, the uncertainty to which is fundamentally dependent on processes that we don't resolve very well and understand relatively poorly. Now, there are things we do understand. I wouldn't go as far as saying we don't know anything about weather, but it's certainly the case that a lot of the uncertainties that we face are about processes that happen at the microphysical scale. They've been ignored. They're hard to solve, they're hard to study. I mean, going into a cloud is not an easy thing to do, right? But I think there's a lot to do there, and it's a really interesting field. And it just tells you that this extraordinarily common molecule is yet very, generative of interesting insights. I did a TV series at one point called H2O, the molecule that made us. I thought it was a very apt title because in a way, all of our life, all of our history is filled with water and our relationship to it.
I love that title, Giulio. That's great. Peter, do you have a question for Giulio?
I mean, Giulio, most of your book is about different civilizations and how they've used water. So I would just love to hear some examples of, say different civilizations in history, say Roman, Egyptian, ancient Chinese, and sort of a little bit of their history and maybe some of the unique aspects that they've had with their relationship with water.
Well, this is a good opportune time to tell everybody to read my book so you can get the full story of all those civilizations. I mean, in the short time that we have, Peter, maybe let me give you two examples. Or maybe three very brief ones. And the distinctions are so profound that I think they just give you a sense of the range, right? And we live in a funny age where if you go to Seattle, where Gerald is, if you come to London, or if you go to Leh, or if you go to Tokyo, your experience of water is identical. That's a peculiar experience in world history. That wasn't always the case, right? That you all had a tap in the wall coming out, jutting out of a wall. So three examples. Let me briefly give you three lines on, let's say, classical Greece, Egypt, Bronze Age Egypt, and the Amazon, actually. Classical Greece, you all have studied your Thucydides and Herodotus, I'm sure. You know, the story of democracy is quickly told. A fellow called Solon comes up with the ingredients of democracy, and then a fellow called Cleisthenes mixes them all together and produces the first experiment in democracy in a slave society, I might add. So this is not exactly the democracy that we imagine today, but nonetheless a distribution of power across society, as opposed to a power given from on high, from some divine right, right? And how did this happen? That happens because the economy of Athens in the 5th and 4th century was an agricultural economy, a very productive one. And the defense of Athens was done by the hoplites, heavily armored infantrymen, who were the defenders. You know, if you read the Peloponnesian Wars or the Persian invasion that Herodotus talked about, the Greek cities, and particularly Athens, is always defended by the phalanx. Now, the hoplites that made up the phalanx were farmers, and they could afford those heavy weapons because they were wealthy farmers. And because they were the defenders of the polis, they demanded political agency. And that's the reason we had those reforms that then gave us the DNA of democracy. They were wealthy because of the distribution of rainfall on Attica, which is the region where Athens is. And in fact, you can go back and reconstruct where different political parties lived in the region and discover that rainfall maps onto the distribution of power. Right, so that's an example of where the distribution of water ended up having a profound impact on the distribution of power. Now you go to Egypt years earlier. We're talking about 1800s BCE, 1,000 years earlier, more than 1,000 years earlier. There's a book that not in a book, but it's a tale that you can read in the form of a book today. It was obviously on papyri at the time, called The Tale of Sinuhe. Tale of Sinuhe. Sinuhe is a fellow who becomes rich in the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, but then gets kicked out of Egypt by a pharaoh. He does a slight, goes and lives with Bedouin tribes out in the desert, and pines to return to Egypt. And through that tale, we discover that the Egyptians had the idea of nationhood. We think that, you know, we think of the nation as a sort of modern concept in many ways, but the Egyptians didn't think of Egypt as a collection of cities. In fact, cities in Egypt didn't have any walls. It was a continuum between the city and the farm, and the boundaries of Egypt were actually national boundaries. And that was because the whole civil life of Egypt was organized by the single river, Nile, right? Herodotus talked of Egypt as the gift of the Nile. And so water there gave that population a sense of identity, a sense of national identity. We know this from the writings. One of the things and the third example is from the Amazon. One of the problems of trying to reconstruct historical narratives is that because you can only do that of the things that have left us, things that have reached us. The variety and diversity of human culture is far greater than the written record affords us. And so sometimes we're blind to completely different ways of organizing society that simply haven't, you know, for which the historical record hasn't reached us. There's an exception to this, which is the interesting story of the tribes that lived in the Amazon before the arrival of the Spaniards. There's a famous book of the descent of the first conquistadores who went down the Amazon at the beginning of the 16th century. It was written up by a friar, Friar the Carvajal, he was called. And he went on this trip down the Nile, and he writes this book, and he describes what he sees. And he describes gleaming white cities in the middle of the forest, vast populations, thousands and thousands of people showing up on the banks. That's how we ended up calling the Amazon, because he thought these were fighting women. And so he used the myth of the Greek origin, right, of the Amazon fighters to call that river the Amazon. That's why we call it the Amazon. For years, for centuries, people thought he was essentially hallucinating, that the Amazon is a virgin forest and nobody could have possibly lived there. And then a few years ago, people started using LiDAR and drones to reconstruct the structure of the terrain under the forest, and discovered huge man-made structures all across Tocantins and sort of parts of the Tapajos Basin, where they realized that, in fact, the Amazon was heavily and densely populated. It's just that it was urbanized in a very different way from the way in which we do today. So it turns out, we've now surmised, that whereas the populations that became sedentary in the Levant domesticated species of cereals and species of animals, the populations of the Amazon became sedentary by domesticating the entire landscape. And so instead of domesticating individual species and essentially creating monocultures, they designed the landscape to domesticate the ecosystem as a system, right? And so they had a system of urbanization that was fully integrated in the forest. Of course, they didn't have any cereals that we would use. They lived off vegetables and other produce. But that's an example of a society that developed a completely different relationship with water and nature on the back of the particular conditions. Then, of course, we came along, bringing in disease. There was a collapse of the population of over 90%. That died in one generation. In fact, we know that because in the carbon record, you can see the dipping atmospheric carbon because all these people died off and the forest regrew, which is kind of remarkable. And the amount of carbon that burst of growth sequestered is equivalent to the carbon we emitted in the 19th century Industrial Revolution. It's a pretty significant change in the ecosystem. So those are three examples, very different from one another. Democracy in Athens, the idea of nationhood in Bronze Age Egypt, and the domestication of the landscape in the pre-Columbian civilizations in the Amazon, that give you a sense of the breadth of how our relationship with water can be generative of social organization.
Giulio, you cease to amaze me and I think us with your vast knowledge and understanding of water in so many dimensions and so many perspectives. Thank you. We're so grateful for you and for the work and research you've done and for sharing this wisdom that you have, and look forward to your next book, which I know you've got in the works, and we'll look forward to seeing that, and to invite you to continue to be part of our community and engage with us and connect with us, and to educate us about water and how we can honor water and we can work with water in our lives, because we know that it's only becoming more and more precious and more dear, and it's just a matter of how high the price of water is going to go until we begin to truly understand and value water.
Yeah,
And
well, it's been a great pleasure, Stuart. So thank you to you and Peter and Didier for organizing, and thank you to all for listening.
Yeah.